Alrighty then. I think we are recording. Hello and welcome to question and answer number 167. Oh, I gotta mute this. Okay. I am your host, Panyo Basa. And you can see we're going for a slight change of scenery this time. I've got like one of those fake backgrounds behind me so that you'll think I'm living in a house. This is my beverage with the little paper umbrella signifying my sophistication and class. And I do think 167 is a prime number. So there's that. And we've got sort of the medium number, so middle path number of questions to answer. So I suppose I should just dive right into it. Let's see here. Unless there's anything I've forgotten to say by way of introduction. I can't really think of anything now. So, and if anyone's triggered by the fact that this TV looks like it's crooked, it's not crooked. It's level. It's just that it's kind of tilted at an angle, which from this angle makes it look crooked, but it's not crooked. So don't even think about it. First question is from Yoshibui. And Yoshibui says, it's been explained several times in past videos, but would you mind explain again the differences between an arahant, a bodhisattva, and a Buddha? Okay, well, an arahant, arahant literally means worthy one. And before it got like adopted by spiritual systems like Buddhism to signify an enlightened being, it was just an honorific. Like I think judges were called araha, and also araha just meaning worthy. It can also mean like I believe there's a word in Pali dandaraha, which means worthy of punishment. So arahant itself is just means worthy one. And in Buddhism, it signifies, at least in Theravada Buddhism, it signifies a fully enlightened being. So the Buddha himself was an arahant. Like Namo Tassa Bhagavato Arahato Sama Sambuddhasa. That Arahato is directed towards the Buddha. The Buddha was an arahant. So an arahant is just any being that is fully enlightened, has no more delusion and no more dukkha, at least no more like mental dukkha. Still, they can feel physical pain, allegedly, but aside from that, they have escaped from samsara. At least after they die, they don't get reborn again, according to Orthodox tradition. So they have won. They have laid down the burden and are free. With regard to a bodhisattva, I think I'll just skip that one and go straight to a Buddha. A Buddha is an arahant. At least the Buddha himself is called an arahant, as I already mentioned. But a Buddha, according to tradition, is a person who has perfected all of the 10 paramis, and they are the ones who rediscover Dhamma after it has disappeared from the world. So it takes special talent, special genius, special perfection for a fully enlightened being to be able to discover Dhamma on their own without a teacher teaching it to them. So that would be the main difference between a Buddha and an ordinary arahant, even though a Buddha is an arahant. Sort of like the difference between a frog and an amphibian. Not that I'm trying to compare the Buddha to frogs or any such thing. So Buddha is like a special class of arahant in this case. Although originally, I do not think there was necessarily a difference, that it was largely a kind of apotheosis of the Buddha, glorification of the founder of the system that made like a radical distinction between an ordinary enlightened being and a Sambuddha, with a number of different classes of enlightened beings in between. Like below a Sambuddha would be a Pacceka Buddha, who is like a Buddha. I mean, he has discovered Dhamma on his own, but he just opts out of starting a religion and just remains a hermit living in a forest somewhere. A fully enlightened Buddha who just doesn't teach Buddhism, doesn't start the wheel rolling again. And then below that, you've got like the chief disciples. Like in the case of the historical Gautama Buddha, it was Sariputta and Mahamoggallana were the two chief disciples, and they're like at a higher level than an ordinary enlightened being. Then you've got the great disciples, of which I believe there were 80. And then below that, you've got ordinary, and then even the ordinary arhats, there's different levels of that even. There's different kinds, different classes of arhat, but we don't really need to go there because I think it's all academic. I think a lot of this is just the ancient Indian philosophical mind that was just obsessed with classifying everything and making hierarchies and all this, that they just went to town on. Really, you're either enlightened or you're not. So then there's the Bodhisattva. And the Bodhisattva is a Mahayana concept. It's based on a Theravada concept, the Bodhisatta. And I've mentioned before that Bodhisattva is probably even a mistranslation of the earlier term Bodhisatta, which Bodhisatta, it was translated into Sanskrit as Bodhisattva by people who thought satta meant being. So a Bodhisattva literally would be like an enlightenment being. But it seems kind of counterintuitive that you call somebody an enlightenment being when in Mahayana Buddhism, they are postponing enlightenment indefinitely until all beings are liberated. But satta can also be a kind of past participle acting as a noun. It's a past participle of the verb sajjati, which means to be attached to or to be bound for. And originally in Theravada Buddhism, a bodhisatta was somebody bound for Buddhahood. They were destined to become a Sambuddha in the future. So, according to like Orthodox tradition, in order to be a bodhisatta, you have to receive what in Burmese is called a byādate, which is a Sambuddha has to declare you a bodhisatta who is destined to become a Sambuddha in the distant future. So in the case of our Gautama Buddha, according to tradition again, it was the Buddha Dipankara, who was like 28 Buddhas ago on some different planet Earth in a different India, who declared the Brahman Sumedho to be, he's going to become a Buddha in this distant future. So in order to be a bodhisatta, you have to have already mastered jhana, I believe, according to tradition. And you have to have this announcement, this prophecy, this prediction, or like, I guess it'd be a prophecy from a Sambuddha that you will become a Sambuddha in a future life. And then starting with that, you are a bodhisatta, and you just spend eons and eons perfecting your virtues, the 10 paramis, like the Jataka stories. It's a genre of Buddhist literature. It's in the Tipitaka, where it's like the Buddha, life after life, he's perfecting his virtues. Sometimes he's an animal, sometimes he's a human, sometimes he's some other kind of being. And he's just like working on perfecting himself, so that they came up with this idea that a Buddha is just like orders of magnitude beyond an ordinary enlightened being, even though technically their wisdom is the same. They both have zero delusion, which means they have both maxed out on wisdom. But then the Mahayana Buddhists took the term bodhisatta, apparently mistranslated it as bodhisattva, and they changed the meaning of it as a kind of a being that in a way is superior to a mere arahant. Arahants just get downplayed in Mahayana. They're considered somehow like deficient. In fact, the term Hinayana in Mahayana Buddhism is a derogatory term for the pre-Mahayana Buddhist schools, which includes Theravada, even though they may not have had Theravada specifically in mind. And hina is like a past participle that means like deficient. It's like a past participle of the verb hiadi, which means like to lose, to fritter away, to squander, to not have enough, that kind of thing. So an arhat, just as review here, before moving on to the next question, an arhat is any fully enlightened being. A bodhisattva is a Mahayanist like mutation of the earlier bodhisattva. A bodhisattva was just someone who was destined to become a Buddha, but a bodhisattva is a being who just essentially vows to postpone enlightenment until all beings are liberated, even though an infinite length of time has already passed and we still have an infinite number of unenlightened beings living in a quasi-reality. These beings are ultimately not even fully real. So it would seem to me that if you want to liberate all beings, you just liberate yourself, like Gautama Buddha probably was teaching people, in this very life, if you are able. And then you realize that all these suffering beings are just sort of virtually real anyway. And then you've liberated them by sort of rendering them no longer ultimately real in your perception. So I think I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Hurdy-Gurdy Man. Hurdy-Gurdy Man says, I'd like to ask a very basic but fundamental question. Why is our will and our existence not in harmony? What is the reason of this ultimate absurdity that we find ourselves in, where conscious will is not law? What went wrong? Well, in a way, conscious will is law. It's just that we are our ego only has like encapsulated within it a limited bandwidth or just a limited scope of what really constitutes our consciousness. So we think that we are, our ego, what we are, this person, this me is consciously aware of, but there's other aspects of our mentality that extend beyond this. Like Freud talked about the subconscious mind. Jung talked about that kind of stuff too. In fact, he referred to the collective unconscious. There's all this subconscious or unconscious mind. And you think unconscious mind would be just an oxymoron. But what it means is that there's consciousness extending beyond the limits of our ego. And the ego is only aware of itself. Or at least with regard to our mentality, there's other kinds of communications coming from the subconscious mind, like through dreams and so forth, that affect us, that can communicate to the ego. But still, the ego is not the entirety of the consciousness that is influencing your life. That there's all this subconscious stuff that's going on that the ego just is not aware of. In fact, the ego can be unaware of some of other aspects of the ego just because, some people just be clueless with regard to their own motives, their own genuine motives, that sort of thing. That's kind of getting into the realm of what Freud would call hysteria. So, some people that aren't particularly Buddhist, like Hindus, for example, like Ram Dass used to say that after you die, then you have access to more of the full scope of consciousness. And then you can make decisions like, well, I guess the best thing for me in my next life will be to be born to a drug-addicted prostitute, and then I'll get brutally murdered in a back alley at the age of 19. All right, that's what I need for my spiritual development. Let's do it. And Buddhism doesn't really teach that way, but still, I do think that there's like an element of truth to that there is like, after you die, in all likelihood, assuming that consciousness persists, you're going to be aware of lots more stuff than you're aware of now, like past lives and so forth. And a fully enlightened being, or just like a sage that is very developed, he's going to have access to a lot more of the mind that in most people is subconscious. So like a spiritually advanced person can remember past lives, for example, going with Buddhist philosophy. So let's just kind of get back to this question here. Why is our will and our existence not in harmony? Your will and your existence are in harmony. It's just that a lot of that will is beyond the scope of your ego. It's still working, it's still going on. Like karma, for example. Karma is a mental state. That's one of the most important aspects of who we are, who we think we are, is our karma, but we're not consciously aware of our karma unless it's like while we're making a decision. We can be aware of our like superficial volitions, but the deeper volitions, the deeper like I don't know, life plans, that kind of thing, the conscious ego just is not aware of that sort of thing, at least not in a fully lucid way. So, I mean, the ultimate absurdity that we find ourselves in is that this one aspect, this like thinking part of our mind has just sort of assumed that it's all that there is, that it's all that exists of our mind, because it just cannot grasp other aspects of our mentality. They're there, it's just that they're invisible to the thinking ego. So what went wrong is the conceit I am that is conjured up by the ego. And let's see, is there anything else I should respond to before moving on to the next question? Our will and our existence really is pretty much in harmony. It's just that we're kind of reckless drivers. We're not really conscious enough not to have bad dreams, for example. Like last night, I had a weird bad dream where someone was like shooting at me, that sort of thing. I mean, my conscious ego I didn't decide, well, I'll just have a dream where somebody's shooting at me and then I'm like locking myself in a cave to get away from the maniac with the gun, this kind of thing. It just happened. It's like some deep aspect of the personality. It's like working on various issues or whatever, and it just kind of percolates up into the conscious mind through remembering dreams you have in your sleep. So let's see here. Yeah, the ultimate absurdity is we think this limited aspect of our mind is us, when really there's much more to it. And I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Jimmy Ladd. And Jimmy Ladd says, can you please speak more about other cosmic Buddhas in previous cosmic cycles? Yeah, well, I already mentioned Dipankara was in reference to the whole Bodhisattva concept. It's first you had Gautama Buddha. I mean, he's sort of the OG Buddha. He's like the founder of Buddhism. Gautama Buddha, the Shakyamuni, the sage of the Shakya clan. He was like the Buddha. But even he in the suttas will refer to enlightened beings before him. And that sort of opened the door to this vast cosmology or mythology, I guess it would be, of just an endless line of Buddhas in an endless line of North Indias. Just going back, it's like the earth respawns with a new India, a new Vedic culture, and Buddhas arise speaking Pali or Sanskrit, some Indic language. And so the Indians, who really had this vast concept of time and distances and so forth, they're measuring how many incalculable eons and world cycles, like kalpas, and that they're trying to describe what was happening, just a zillion gajillion years ago. So a lot of it is just mythology. It's sort of elaborating on Buddhist ideas and just creating this elaborate Buddhist cosmos and mythos that people can believe in. People need to believe something. They need to cling to some kind of belief system, which is really contrary to what the Buddha was teaching. I mean, you shouldn't believe in anything. Belief is delusion. Belief is thinking that you know something that you don't really know. I'm waving my hands around a lot, probably because of the background that's making me look like I live in a house. So I think there's mention of 7 Buddhas. I mean, I really never really took this very seriously. I mean, all that really matters to me is Gautama Buddha. He's the only one that it has any kind of historical evidence, really. All the rest lived zillions of years ago. I mean, even the Buddha's predecessor was Kassapa Buddha, who lived on this planet. I think there were like 7 Buddhas living just on this earth. But it's like you have a Buddha, and then after the Buddha passes away, you've got Dhamma abides. You've got Buddhism in the world, and then finally Buddhism dies out because everything that has a beginning has an end. The law of anicca, and so then you have this lawless period of no Buddhism, no Dharma, just civilization degenerates, and then finally some new Buddha rediscovers Dhamma and sets the wheel turning again. And so I think earlier than the 28 Buddhas is like the 7 Buddhas. And then they started going back into previous earths, all the way back to Dipankara. He's really the first Buddha that gets talked about in Buddhist mythology. And he's the one who gave the prediction or the prophecy that our Buddha would become Gautama Buddha, or, that Sumedho, the Brahmin of that time, in some previous earth, this incalculable eons ago, that he would eventually become Gautama Buddha on this planet. And if you read, I mean, the main text that discusses this sort of thing is the Buddha Wamsam, the lineage of Buddhas. It's a relatively late text. It's not common to all the schools of Buddhism. And it goes back to Dipankara, I'm pretty sure. And if you read the biographies of these previous Buddhas, you find that our Gautama Buddha was by far the shortest Buddha. He was only 27 feet tall, according to tradition. The other Buddhas, they're like 100 feet tall. And he went through our Buddha went through like 6 years of dukkaracharya, just these ascetic practices, just sort of almost killing himself. Whereas some of these previous Buddhas, it was only a few weeks for them. And their life cycle, I mean, the Buddha was also our Buddha. Our Gautama Buddha was like the shortest lived Buddha, because some of these Buddhas were living like 84,000 years, this kind of thing. So, I mean, like I say, I've never really been able to take it very seriously. That I'm sure there have been fully enlightened beings in the past before Gautama Buddha. I got no problem with that. I mean, they weren't even necessarily Buddhists, but this like archetype of every one of these Sammasam Buddhas, all 28. I guess Maitreya, the future Buddha, will be, or Maitreya in Sanskrit, would be 29. He'd be like the 8th Buddha of this planet, if I remember correctly. And really, like I say, I've never really taken this kind of stuff very seriously. But they all have the same life. They all live in a palace, and whichever caste or varna in Pali is considered to be the highest one, the Buddha is always born into that caste. So like in the time of Gautama Buddha, the Kshatriya caste, the Katiya caste in Pali, or the Katiya Varna was the highest caste, or considered to be. So the Buddha was born as one of those. In other iterations of Vedic culture, when the Brahmins are considered the highest, which eventually became like the status quo in India after the Buddhist time, then the Buddha is born a Brahmin, always male. There are no female Buddhas according to ancient Buddhist tradition. And then they all have to go through, they see the signs, they all have to renounce the world, they all have to practice. And when they renounce the world, they do it. There's like 4 possible vehicles. You know, they can be on a horse, in a chariot, on an elephant, or in some kind of flying castle or flying palace called a Vimana. And then they all have the austerities. They all have to have like a group of ascetics practicing these austerities with them. The Buddha had the smallest number of all of them. He only had 5. I mean, in some of these previous Buddhas, it was like thousands, if not millions. And then always they have to be offered milk rice by some lay woman, right, on the eve of their enlightenment. They all have to be sitting under a specific kind of Bodhi tree. Each Buddha has its own Bodhi tree. Some Bodhi trees are like, you know, different kinds of trees. Our Gautama Buddha was sitting under a peepal tree, Ficus religiosa. So, I mean, I think that it's mostly just made up mythology, to tell you the truth. All religions have made up mythologies, and that's some of the Buddhist made up mythology that happened relatively early on, but not like really super early times, but over the first few centuries of the existence of Buddhism in India, this sort of thing developed, largely along with devotionalism, just glorifying the Buddha and coming up with all these legends about him and so forth. So Jimmy Ladd then asks, what do you think of the prophesied Maitreya Buddha? And in Pali, that would be Mateya. I think it's just part of the same system of the 28 Buddhas, just one Buddha like projected into the future. And I think he's the future Mateya Buddha. He's not going to come to this earth until Buddhism as it exists now has died out. Because you cannot have another Buddha arise to rediscover Dhamma until Dhamma has disappeared from the earth. And then he can rediscover it. So there have been a lot of people claiming to be Maitreya Buddha. In fact, I think even L. Ron Hubbard, the founder of Scientology, was declared, at least by some of his followers, to be Maitreya Buddha. But I think it's mythology, in my opinion. So, I mean, that doesn't mean that there isn't going to be like a future Buddha, but like all these explicit details about his name and all this sort of stuff, it's guesses, in my opinion. I mean, just think of what the poets did to like Greek paganism. They just messed it all up with all these weird stories of the gods being all rapey and stuff. It just kind of ruined paganism. After people became more sophisticated in their culture, they just couldn't take it seriously anymore. And I think a lot of this mythology in Buddhism, it's already kind of, most Westerners just can't really take it very seriously. If they don't know much about it, you know, they just hear Maitreya is going to be the next Buddha. They can take that seriously. They can believe that. They can believe that the OG Gautama Buddha, that he actually predicted that Mateya Buddha would be his successor as the next Buddha, probably millions of years in the future. But the more you study this kind of stuff, like you read the Buddha Wamsa and its commentaries, and it's like Monty Python-esque. It's like most Westerners, unless they're very faith-oriented and are capable of believing anything, they're just not going to be able to swallow it very well. So I'm just going to move on to Jimmy Ladd's next question, which is as follows. Could it be that Christ was the Maitreya Buddha whose sacrifice on the cross enabled the projection of a pure love and mercy that it reordered the nature of samsara and enabled others to latch onto this love via devotion and karmically level up, so to speak, and enter heavenly realms where they could practice more devotion in this love metta produced? Well, again, just based on Orthodox tradition, you can't have another Buddha which would be Maitreya Buddha or Maitreya Buddha, until Buddhism has disappeared from this earth. There are some people who maybe are a little bit cynical who would say, well, true Buddhism is already gone. In fact, there's the famous prophecy that given in the Pali texts where the Buddha says the true Dhamma will survive for only 500 years. But that would still rule out Jesus of Nazareth because, Jesus of Nazareth was a little under 500 years after the time of the Buddha, I'm pretty sure. Especially with revisionist estimates of when the Buddha actually lived. And of course, then you have to go through the cycle of the degeneracy of the human race, the lifespan getting down to like 10 years, that kind of thing, which didn't happen. So, and then going just with Orthodox tradition, Jesus would not have been fully enlightened because, like, he cried. Jesus wept outside the tomb of Lazarus. Jesus got into bad moods, that kind of thing. So going from just a strictly Buddhist traditional metric, Jesus of Nazareth, he was no doubt a holy man, but he was not fully enlightened, just going by Buddhist standards. With regard to, so Jesus Christ, or just Jesus of Nazareth, that's really a stretch. That Maitreya Buddha is itself this kind of mythology, and then trying to like impose Indian mythology on a somewhat mythologized Hebrew. It's just, I really don't think that it fits. It doesn't stick. So his sacrifice on the cross, I'm not even sure that Jesus of Nazareth being crucified was much of a sacrifice. He was a political criminal being executed by the government, and enabled the projection of a pure love and mercy. Well, the Buddhists were more merciful than the Christians. Even Jesus, according to the New Testament, was helping his disciples catch fish, for example, which is not very merciful to the fish. Whereas in Buddhism, you don't even kill animals. In fact, a Buddhist monk isn't even supposed to damage a living plant. So let's see here. I do think that Christianity in the West, it was kind of an upgrade of like the spiritual caliber of the mainstream of Western civilization. It brought like compassion. It was like the first openings of the heart chakra in mainstream Western civilization. Not that there weren't compassionate, merciful, benevolent, even relatively enlightened people in the West before the time of Jesus. It's just that he kind of brought it into the mainstream. He and Paul kind of collaborated and brought compassion into the mainstream in the West. You read older, like pagan literature, like fiction, read the Golden Ass of Apuleius, and people were, they were very harsh. They were hard, callous people back then, just because death was so prevalent, public executions and all this, that nowadays, people just couldn't deal with it. We have gotten much more compassionate in modern times, and also, of course, much more feminized in modern times. We're much less militant than we used to be, and just less stoic with regard to just accepting the harshness of life. It's just something is just part of life. Harshness and suffering and death is just the way it is. So just deal with it. That was sort of like the ancient classical attitude. Die gloriously. Don't die in bed. At least if you're a man. Die with honor. So, I do not think that Jesus of Nazareth was Maitreya Buddha. I don't think that he was any Buddha. I'm kind of skeptical. I'm not sure that he was fully enlightened. I think he was a wise and good man. I do think that he had what a Buddhist would call psychic powers, that I would not at all be surprised if he healed the sick or even walked on water. But you don't have to be fully enlightened to heal the sick or walk on water. That's psychic powers that come from, deep realizations, just sort of breaking the mold of the samsaric normie, so to speak. Taking the red pill. So let's see here. I guess I answered that question. I'll just move on to the next question. This is from Xenothoid. Excuse me. I apologize to Xenothoid for semi-belching while saying his name. Xenothoid says, does this meme accurately describe the primary kilesa of each section of the political sphere? And I forgot to bring up the meme that he's referring to. So I'm doing that now. Okay. So he's got this meme that is the traditional political compass map. It's like this square grid, and you've got authoritarian at the top, libertarian at the bottom, left on the left, and right on the right. And you can take these like quizzes, these tests to see where you fit on the political spectrum. And I've taken the test a few times, and I always wind up sort of towards the middle, just slightly below the line between authoritarian and libertarian. So anyways, mapped onto this map are the 7 deadly sins. He calls them kilesas, which in Pali is usually translated as defilement. Kilesa is defilement, but it's the 7 deadly sins of Christianity. And so the far authoritarian left corner is envy. The authoritarian right corner is wrath. The libertarian left corner is gluttony. And the libertarian right corner is greed. And then right in the center, you've got sloth. And then the center, like authoritarian center between left and right, is pride. And the center between left and right at the libertarian extreme in the middle is lust. And let's just get back to the question here. Does this meme accurately describe the primary kilesa of each section of the political sphere? I think it could be like a general trend. I don't know, maybe somehow you could figure out how to do a statistical analysis to see if there is some statistically valid correlation. But I'm not exactly sure how you do that. So the authoritarian left is mainly governed by envy, in a way, like resentment, kind of. Maybe. The authoritarian right is wrath, which, I don't know, not necessarily. I mean, really, the authoritarian right might be more into pride than wrath. It's just honor, following orders, that kind of thing. So, like feudal Japan could be arguably called something like authoritarian right. And they weren't so much into wrath as just like pride. Then let's see, libertarian left, gluttony. It kind of works out that way, but lust would fit in there just as well. Sloth might fit in there. Just about any of the 7 deadlies could fit into like an extreme leftist libertarian. And then libertarian right is greed, which, that's kind of what young people think about, like conservatives. They're just greedy. They want money. At least that's the way it was when I was young. It was like the Republicans are the people out for as much money as possible. Whereas, ironically, nowadays, most of the multi-billionaires are leftists, or at least they promote leftist causes. So, yeah, I think there could be like a general trend in this kind of direction. It's like an authoritarian rightist might be more likely to be wrathful than an authoritarian leftist, or a libertarian rightist might be more likely to be greedy than a libertarian leftist, and the libertarian leftist might be more likely to be gluttonous than a libertarian rightist, and so forth. But Yeah, I think you'd have to do a statistical analysis to see if there really is some kind of statistically valid correlation going on. But I mean, there could be like general trends, not a majority, but at least like what is it? What is it when it's not a majority, but it's still the highest number of a plurality? It might be pluralities, but I don't know. So I'm just gonna close that window out and move on to the next question. With all due respects to Xenothoid, I might not have done proper. Let's see, what I've done it. What's the word? Gosh, I don't know. I just didn't do it well enough or something. Maybe I don't know. So I'm just gonna move on to the next question. This is from Gordon, and Gordon says, "How does the clergy interact with or help the laity in traditional Buddhist societies? I know lay Buddhists give food to monks, but how do the teachings of the monks filter down to the laity? Do they go to a building once a week like Abrahamics, listen to talks, etc.? How familiar with Buddhist doctrine are the laity?" So that's two questions right there, isn't it? Which is going to bring us into the transgressive realm of fourth questions. But let's just do it. I mean, there's 4 question marks in this one question, which is already a red flag. I mean, one question should have one question mark. So, how does the clergy, the Sangha, interact with or help the laity in traditional Buddhist societies? I know lay Buddhists give food to monks. How do the teachings of the monks filter down to the laity? Okay, do they go to a building once a week like Abrahamic system? Yeah, like in Buddhist Asia, especially Theravada Buddhist Asia, like Burma, you've got Uposatha Day, which is the full moon, the new moon, and the half moon, or at least it's called that. But it's done according to a tradition that isn't always astronomically correct. You can be 1 or 2 days off of the actual full moon on Uposatha Day, and on Uposatha days, it is the tradition for lay people to go to the monastery. They take 8 precepts instead of just 5, and then they'll listen to a Dhamma talk, and then they'll like help around the monastery. They'll do stuff that monks aren't supposed to do, like pulling weeds, that kind of thing. And they'll drink tea and they'll talk and have a nice time. It's kind of like their day off, and then they go back home again. And let's see. So there is that, but also if lay people have a problem in their personal life, they often go to like the village monk to ask for advice. And when I spent some time in Bali in Indonesia, and there was an Indonesian monk there. He was Theravada Buddhist. And when he was there, I mean, he spent most of his time in Burma, but when he would come back to visit his family or whatever in Bali, it was just like people were just coming to him all the time. It seems to be more of a cultural thing in Bali than in Burma, that you just go to the monk with your problems. And so it's like, this guy's fighting with his mother. They're not getting along. They go to the monk and ask him for advice, that kind of thing. And a lot of the time it works fairly well, although really a monk, especially a monk who was ordained as a child and never really lived a worldly life, with interacting with women and kids and like having to pay bills and so forth, that there's some questions they might not be really good at answering, which is one thing in the West. One reason why Western Buddhists often prefer lay teachers to monk teachers is that the lay teachers have more experience in the kind of problems that lay people are more likely to have, and so they're better able to give advice with regard to that. And health advice. I mean, some monks will just give horrible, just quack medical advice to lay people. And monks in Burma, especially famous monks, Sayadaws, they just kind of have people assuming that they're infallible for so long that they start assuming it themselves. And they'll just start blurting out decrees and so forth that it doesn't always work out that way. Like there was this one doctor that I knew in Burma. He had this like a scrapbook of just gnarly pictures of like a woman comes to a monk in some remote village. She's got like a lump on her breast. He just assumes that it's a boil. He just takes a needle and pops it, which then causes the cancer cells to metastasize and get worse. So, yeah, you shouldn't go to a monk for like medical problems, or even like family problems. I mean, family problems, maybe. I mean, it can just be a universal dharmic answer. You and your mother aren't getting along. The monk can just suggest, after hearing the details, just send metta, be patient, have respect for your parents, within this context. Or just, they can give sort of generic kind of advice. But with regard to specifics, how should I invest my money? That kind of thing. Or, what should I do about this pain in my leg? That kind of thing. You're better off not going to a monk about that sort of thing. Something that has really something central to do with Dharma or Dhamma, something that can be answered in terms of Buddhist philosophy or Buddhist practice, then you maybe do well to go to a monk. In fact, you'd probably do better in cases like that going to a monk than going to a lay person. You might do better going to a monk with regard to like psychological issues than you would by going to like a licensed therapist, because psychologists and psychiatrists for the most part are basket cases. Most of them are nutty or just like very samsaric. So I hope I answered that question. So now I'm going to answer sort of the last part of that question, the fourth question mark, which is how familiar with Buddhist doctrine are the laity? And in the West, they're fairly ignorant. In fact, some of the monks are fairly ignorant of like Buddhist doctrine in the West. I've sat through a few Dhamma talks given by Western monks in the West, and Burmese villagers would know more about Dhamma than this monk. The monk's saying like the first verse of the Dhammapada says that the mind is like an ocean, and I mean he said that this one monk said that twice, like in two different Dhamma talks. He makes the same claim that the first verse of the Dhammapada says that the mind is like an ocean. You can read, there's no mention at all of oceans in the first verse of the Dhammapada. It doesn't say that at all. But the lay people, they just loved him. They were just soaking it up like a sponge because they didn't know any better. Whereas some Burmese villager with a fourth grade education, I mean, their mouth would be open, or they might be like snickering behind their hand at the Burmese villager sitting next to him. It's like, you hear what he just said? Because Burmese villagers, even if they only have like a fourth grade formal education, they know about Abhidhamma. They know all the stories from the commentaries. They know the basic tenets of Buddhism, if they're devout Buddhists. I mean, if they just don't care, then, they're just very superficial Buddhists, just like a lot of Christians in the West are just very superficial Christians that don't, for example, even know that there's a book of Lamentations in the Bible. The book of Lamentations, a lot of Western Christians would be surprised to hear, what, there's a book of Lamentations in the Bible? Yeah, it's one of the books of the Bible. So there's a lot of sort of superficial Buddhists that are just Buddhists because they were just born into a Buddhist culture. But still, there are lots and lots of Burmese villagers who they go and listen to the monk give the talk on Uposatha Day, and they'll even like read Buddhist books and so forth, and they know more about Buddhism than a lot of Buddhist teachers in the West. Just the average Burmese village Buddhist. So, yeah, the laity, at least the devout laity in Buddhist Asia, like in Burma especially, that's the one place that I have the most experience with, so I can speak with more authority with regard to what Burma is like than any other Buddhist country. That, yeah, they understand their Dhamma fairly well. In fact, they understand it better than a lot of Buddhist teachers in the West know it. So I think I'm just going to move on to Gordon's next question, which is as follows. From what I've heard from you and others, in Buddhist cosmology, the universe dies and is reborn. A Buddha comes into being and teaches. Eventually, those teachings are forgotten and everything descends. what do these Buddhist end times look like before another Buddha arises? Is anything written about it? And maybe I should have looked up the reference, but there's this long, weird sutta towards the end of the Digha Nikaya where the Buddha talks about this sort of thing. He's talking about sort of cosmology. He's talking about like the origin of the earth and everything, which in other suttas he won't answer. That's just a waste of time bothering with that sort of thing. But in this one long sutta towards the end of the Digha Nikaya, he just goes for it. And again, I really have never been particularly interested in Buddhist mythology, except from maybe like an anthropological point of view. So, according to him, or according to the sutta, I should say, because there's no guarantee that the Buddha really taught this, especially considering that he refused to answer these questions in numerous other suttas. And also, suttas that are towards the back of a collection of suttas, like statistically are less likely to be authentic as a general rule. For example, the Anguttara Nikaya, the numerical discourses, the whole 11th book, I've heard certain scholars claim the whole chapter 11 of the Anguttara Nikaya is probably a later edition. Probably would start off just 1 through 10. Anyhow, the end times, it just gets, civilization degenerates until, and also the human lifespan degenerates until you're down to like a lifespan of 10 years. You hit puberty at 5, and then, and people are essentially just, there's no Dhamma at all. Nobody really is keeping any kind of precepts. There's no virtue. People are just essentially killing and eating each other. And then it just hits sort of rock bottom and then starts improving again. And then after it has improved sufficiently that you have at least the potential for Dhamma again, then the next Buddha comes along. But the end times, it's way worse than any end times that we've experienced recently. It's worse than World War II, worse than, worse than anything in modern history. So we haven't got there yet. So from the Buddhist point of view, all we have to look forward to is further decline. Although there can be little bumps, a little bit of uphill before, you continue the downhill slide. Sort of like the decline of the Roman Empire was sort of like that too. It wasn't just constant decline. Every once in a while, you'd have a good emperor who would make reforms and so forth. Things would get better for a little while, and then they'd go back downhill again. So that's kind of the way it is for us from a Buddhist point of view. We're still on the downhill slide. It's going to get a lot worse before it gets any better. Although there can be like intervals of improvement before you hit the cliff again. So let's see here. Gordon's fourth question, I guess, since I separated out his compound first question into two questions. She says, if America were to become Buddhist majority with no demographic or government change, i.e. most people freely convert to it, what do you think the country would look like after that? What would change? What would stay the same? To clarify, I mean the American people become Buddhists as in they believe and follow it to the same extent most humans believe and follow their religion, not necessarily all become enlightened. Well, if America were to become a Buddhist majority country, the main thing that would change would be Buddhism itself. Because, you just look at some of the academic papers written by Western Buddhists, and it's like queer Buddhism and feminist Buddhism and all this kind of stuff that the Buddha never taught. He probably would not endorse very much of it. So what would change is that Buddhism would change, and you'd wind up with something hardly recognizable, and which is already happening in the West. It's like a long time ago. This is like the late 80s, I think. I think it was the ABC, the American Buddhist Congress or something, had this convention, this Buddhist convention. And one of the keynote speakers there gave this speech about how the top priority for Western Buddhism would be to abolish the Sangha. And that was what Buddhism was all about originally. The Buddha was a monk. He taught Buddhism to monks. It was a monastic spiritual system. That if you really wanted to follow Buddhism like really strictly and correctly, the first thing you should do, renounce the world and become a monk. And in the West, it's just not like that. So there would have to be a major change in worldview for people to become good Buddhists, like for Buddhism not to just become like mutated into something the Buddha himself would denounce, which is to some degree what has already happened in the West. You have like just dealing with Theravada. You've got sort of the boomer Vipassana movement, which was largely based on Mahasi Sayadaw's teachings. And I mean, there's still some valid Dhamma in it, but it's just a very secular, worldly kind of Dhamma where it's more a matter of trying to sleep more comfortably than actually waking up. And then there's the Goenka method, which despite its superficiality with regard to philosophy and so forth, it may be like the best version, the mass version of Theravada Buddhism in the West. Although there are a lot of more like monastic systems arising in the West, especially the Ajahn Chah tradition. So the Ajahn Chah tradition and just like Thai Buddhism, Western monks in a Thai tradition, like settling in the West and becoming like missionaries. That helps. But when you've got monks that are missionaries, they have to be politically correct. It's mostly leftists who are going to take Buddhism seriously, because the right-wing conservatives, if they're religious at all, they're more likely to be Christians or Jews. So you got monk missionaries coming to the West, settling down like in a liberal type of city. And, you've got the people going to the monastery that are wanting like, gay pride events, this kind of thing. They want to hear more about mindfulness of white privilege and so forth. And it just kind of derails Dhamma to some degree when you have that kind of situation. But you can't have monks just saying, like, for example, according to the second noble truth, all suffering is caused by craving. Craving is volitional. Therefore, all suffering is ultimately self-inflicted. You can't just blame Whitey or blame patriarchal men or blame the government, for your own suffering. It's ultimately self-created. And to say that kind of thing will have people they'll just get pissed off. A lot of them will. They just, you'll just be driving away your potential Buddhist converts. But let's say, just for the sake of argument, that America were to become a Buddhist majority country with less leftist craziness contaminating the Dhamma. Because like a lot of leftists, they cannot tell the difference between like progressivism and Dharma. They just assume that the Buddha was a progressive because he was enlightened. But then, it'd be like, it wouldn't really be all that different. How many Christians nowadays really take Christianity seriously? Like, how many Christians nowadays in the West gather not up their treasures upon the earth? There's even one of the epistles of Paul, I'm pretty sure, says that if you become a Christian at a time when you're not married yet, you shouldn't get married because Jesus is coming. You got to get ready for that. On the other hand, if you're already married when you become a Christian, then stay married. But stuff like that, and gathering not up your treasures upon the earth, even like, love your enemies and bless those that curse you. At least there are some devout Christians that at least make some efforts in along those lines. They try to forgive their enemies, bless those that curse them. Still, they're getting families. They need to make as much money as they can. They're still in the world and of the world. And if America or the West were to convert to Buddhism, it would be the same kind of thing. It would be like secular Buddhism for the most part. American culture in particular, and there'd have to be a radical change for Americans to really eagerly just get down on their knees and bow to monks, to have like this higher class of humans. Like in Burma, the word for human being, Lu, isn't even used for monks. Monks are considered to be literally superhuman. And that sort of thing just isn't going to fly very well in a relatively egalitarian culture like America. But I think if things get bad, especially, just economically or whatever, there would be more and more people who are less taking the renunciation route, just bailing out of society. Who knows, maybe a lot of like incels and so forth would just take that route. Just sort of like latent homosexuals in Burma often become monks just to give them a socially acceptable excuse for not getting married to a woman. And it seems like when I was in Burma anyway, just about any like Mahasi center in town that was relatively well funded, well supported, relatively comfortable, would always have like an assistant Seattle who was a latent homosexual. They would stay away from the rough forest monasteries, that kind of thing, but they would kind of gravitate towards the more comfortable places and towns. So, I mean, if America were to become a Buddhist majority country, I really don't think there'd be all that much change, because, I mean, you have to change the religion to fit the mainstream culture. They're not just gonna, like abandon the military. They're just not gonna just shut down the military because that's adharmic. You shouldn't be harming others, that kind of thing. They're just gonna have to. They would change Buddhism, so it really wouldn't be all that different from Christianity. Which may not be the answer that Gordon was expecting, but that's pretty much the way it would be, I'm pretty sure. Okay. So I guess I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Romeo. And Romeo is asking kind of a similar question, I think. Kind of along the same lines of if some religion were to take over the West, anyhow. He says, back in Q&A number 163, you addressed my questions about whether you could ever see a revival of the type of paganism that existed in pre-Christian Europe gain any substantial following in the West. You didn't realistically see this happening except by a few on the fringes of society. To fill the current spiritual vacuum that now largely exists in the West, you speculated that a kind of revamped Christianity and even some form of Buddhism may step in to fill this void. I was wondering if you think Islam could ever realistically fill this gap, not that I would want it to. After all, Islam has already taken over large swaths of Europe, or is it swathes? Large swathes of Europe, and is now making inroads and growing rapidly, even in these good old United States. Yeah, especially around Dearborn, Michigan. If you do think it is possible for Islam to take over the West, what does this bode for the flourishing of Buddhism throughout the West? Would it just be stomped out? Well, before I actually answer the question, first I should point out that I think Q&A 163 was also a prime Q&A. And let's see. I have had this idea that, I don't think it's likely, but it is possible that you could have like a new sort of religious system in the West that would resemble sort of the cult of the emperors in Rome. Trump could be deified. It's not impossible. I don't think he'd be declared a god by the Senate, which is the way it worked in Rome. But he could have some kind of cult going at some point in the future. Not that he would be like consciously the leader of it. He'd probably be passed away by then. But it is theoretically possible. You could have some sort of like emperor worship kind of thing happening in the West, especially when you've got this civil Cold War, which is getting warmer and warmer all the time between left and right, where the left, they just hate Donald Trump, they hate his supporters, and the right is just getting more and more just fed up and pissed off at the temper tantrums of the left. And so, eventually, it does seem that the right is winning at present, that the left is becoming so hysterical and so hate-filled, and it's like in a hypocritical way, declaring the other side to be the hateful side. So it's like my hate is justified because they are hateful, that sort of thing. That it really is driving more and more people away, so that you could have just this seismic shift to the right. Not that I'm holding my breath, and it wouldn't even necessarily be all that good of a thing. It might be better just to restore the Democratic Party to some semblance of sanity. That you could have like a cult of the emperors that could become sort of like a new religion in the West, at least in America. But let's see here. I mean, it's possible something like neo-Stoicism could replace religion in the West. But again, it would take some really charismatic, inspired sort of teacher of that to really get the ball rolling, or to get the wheel rolling in a stoic kind of way. So let's just get to the question, though. See, if you do think it is possible for Islam to take over the West, what does that bode for the flourishing of Buddhism throughout the West? Would it just be stomped out? Yeah, probably. Yeah, I think once you get a critical mass of Muslims, especially certain kinds of Muslims, I mean, there's different kinds. There's more intolerant sort of Muslims, but I mean, the intolerant Muslims are the ones that are more strictly following the Quran. So, yeah, I mean, that history would show that, yeah, Buddhism doesn't compete very well with Islam, especially once Islam reaches a certain percentage of the population, because Buddhists are nonviolent and Islam is a violent religion. And it's just right there in the Quran. So, yeah, I mean, Islam entering India pretty much spelled the end of Buddhism in India. So, yeah, I do think that Buddhism would pretty much go extinct in the West if the West became predominantly Muslim. That's just a guess, though. Who knows? I mean, for example, it could be the same kind of deal as I was just mentioning with regard to America becoming Buddhist. If America became Muslim, they'd be like lukewarm, tolerant Muslims. You'd probably have like Muslim queer groups and so forth that would be abomination from the point of view of the founder of the religion. But it's just America, or Western civilization in general, is just not very religious, not very spiritual, especially in modern times after science pretty much replaced Christianity as a way of describing the cosmos. So, yeah, I mean, you cannot serve both God and mammon, and the West specializes in mammon. So, I mean, it's possible that Islam, if it took over the West, would be so lukewarm that it would just tolerate Buddhism. But if it were like a fundamentalist Islam, then yeah, I think even Christianity would be in dire straits. There'd be like persecuted sects of hardened Christians here and there, sort of like you still have in the Middle East. But I'm not sure how well Buddhists harden under certain circumstances. They mostly just go away or get killed. So, but whether Islam could take over, Romeo is kind of asking that also, even though there's no question mark right after it. He's wondering if I think Islam could ever realistically fill the religious gap in the West after the decline of Christianity. Yeah, especially in Europe, because, in the West, it's mostly Hispanics that are crossing the border into America, whereas in Europe, there's a much higher percentage of Muslims who are entering, military-age Muslim men who make no secret of the fact that they despise Western civilization. They're just there for the free handouts. So, yeah, Islam could possibly take over if, like, Western civilization becomes so degenerate and so feminized that the men of the West just aren't even going to fight back. They're not going to stand up for their heritage and all that. Then, yeah, it could easily happen, especially in Europe, I think. Europe is definitely more castrated than America is now. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from PSA. And PSA is somewhat of a Weisenheimer, I should say. And he says, in your esteemed capacity as the curator of a closed aquatic biome, how do you navigate the intricate and multifactorial physico-chemical equilibria necessary to sustain a stable internal milieu, constancy within, maybe he's trying to say constantly, within your ichthyological prototype, particularly in regard to mitigating the insidious onset of eutrophication and the subsequent perturbations in nitrogenous waste biotransformations within your finite cartilaginous vertebrate limnological microcosm? Well, yeah, I have had a problem with eutrophication lately. And for those of you who aren't like into ecology, eutrophication means excess of nutrients. So, I mean, I actually did an aquarium video months ago where I was discussing this, and it was like an unintended prophecy because it happened to me after I was mentioning the possibility of it, where you keep adding food to your fish tank, but you're not doing water changes regularly. You know, you're trying to have like a balanced ecosystem in there so that everything kind of stays in balance. But when you're adding certain kinds of food, there's like certain like minerals especially that aren't being taken back out of the system by plants. See, like with regard to nitrogenous wastes, the fish pee into the water, bless their hearts, and you got plants like hornwort, which is excellent for this. It just sucks the nitrogen right back out of the water again. No problem. But the plants aren't taking out enough of the minerals. You know, they're taking out the nitrogen, and a lot of the organic stuff is just being broken down by bacteria and so forth. But the minerals, especially, just have been building up in my aquarium so that the water is very hard now. And I've just had to start doing water changes. So I'm doing like a water change once a week, you know, like a 20% water change once a week now, just trying to get the pH and the water hardness back down to a level that isn't stressing out the creatures. Or like the shrimp especially is kind of counterintuitive. The shrimp like a little slightly acidic water with low mineral content. You know, they like soft water, which, I mean, you think they're crustaceans, you know, they want calcium in their shells and all that they like minerals in the water, but for some reason, they're just evolved to live in soft water. And so when my water started getting hard, I didn't realize what the problem was at first. The shrimp just stopped reproducing. That was like one of the first red flags. And then some of the fish started stressing out too. But so I've started doing water changes. Have I addressed everything in here? That's I like having like a balanced ecosystem, like lots of plants. You know, my aquarium, especially my 32-gallon tank, is very jungly now. So that a lot of the fish that live on the bottom, the scavengers on the bottom, I hardly ever see them because they're just living in the bushes. I should have at least 10 amano shrimp in there, and I rarely see an amano shrimp just because they're just hiding in the plants all the time. But having an aquarium where you don't do water changes, if you can have it so perfectly balanced that you don't feed the fish, then you can do that. You know, it's just like this enclosed system where the fish, you just have a few nanofish that are like feeding on biofilm, that kind of thing. And then so long as you're not adding any more nutrients into the water, you shouldn't have a problem. But if you are adding food, then gradually there's going to be a mineral content is increasing in that aquarium, and you're going to have to do water changes at the very least, you know, like a weekly water change, just to keep the water, like the water hardness down. Because otherwise it just gets hard in the tank, just due to gradual buildup of certain types of nutrients or other substances, especially minerals. But my aquarium, even though I rarely, or up until recently, wasn't doing many water changes or changing the filter much, I mean, there was no problem with nitrogen because there's so many plants in there. They just suck the fertilizer right out of the water. It's just this mineral stuff that the plants don't need that much. And so it just keeps building up in the water. And I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Rui. And Rui says, would you say that samsara is not a region of experience, but the totality of experience? I would say that samsara is perception. So, I mean, you can do with that as you will. You can interpret that as you like. Is perception the totality of experience? I think probably not. Just like bare consciousness isn't necessarily samsaric because it's not perceptual. But to the extent that consciousness is perceptual, to that same extent it is samsaric. Perception is samsara. Perception is, or samsara is meaning. So, yeah, I would, it all depends on how you're going to define experience, I guess. If experience is necessarily samsaric, then you could say, well, then the totality of experience would be samsara. But if you think that the totality of experience is not 100% perceptual, then I would say it's just a kind of region of experience, the perceptual region. And I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Nirmit. Nirmit says, thoughts on Osho? I have heard some of his speeches in Hindi, and I must say the guy was a crazy good orator and definitely seemed very wise. Yeah, I've written a few essays on Osho. If my fourth book ever comes out, there's going to be some significant mentioning of Osho in that fourth book also. Yeah, there was one essay I wrote in particular. It's like the enigmatic Bhagwan. Because, I mean, for most of his life, he was the Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh. He didn't start calling himself Osho until right towards the end, I think. So my thoughts on Osho, I don't think he was enlightened. I've read a few of his books, and his books are more glib than wise, it seems to me. That, I mean, he did have the ability to give a 2-hour-long Dharma talk every day, which just blows my mind. I mean, when I was in Bali especially, I was asked to give a Dhamma talk every day. And, I mean, the Dhamma talk would only be like 20 or 30 minutes maybe. But still, after a few weeks, I'm starting to like rack my brains. What should I talk about this time? You know, it's like you just run out of ideas after a while. You run out of topics that really resonate with you. And for Osho, back when he was living in Pune, India, at the ashram in Pune, he was giving a 2-hour-long Dhamma talk at least once a day, and he was just going with it. But reading his books, you see that, I mean, he has like these glib answers that kind of makes him seem like he's wise because he can answer so easily. But you think about it and it's like, wait a minute. No, I don't think so. That kind of thing. And you just look at how his whole system worked out, and it kind of was a fiasco. One fiasco after another. And of course, Osho really did get first pick of all the pretty sannyasins and all that. So my personal opinion on Osho is that he had attained something. You know, he was working at a higher level of consciousness than the average person. But just because you're at a higher level of consciousness doesn't mean that you're necessarily wiser or better. You know, like a monkey is at a higher level of consciousness than a sheep, but a monkey is a lot nastier than a sheep. So, or at least they have the reputation for being nastier than sheep. So yeah, I think that he did kind of make some kind of breakthrough, like through meditation or whatever. And he was clever and a good speaker. And he had like the big, dark, penetrating eyes, sort of like the Naga King in the first Conan the Barbarian movie. You know, James Earl Jones. Was that him? James Earl Jones? He had like those big, soulful, dark, mesmerizing eyes. Osho had that too. But like when they moved to Antelope, Oregon, which is when I found out about it, because I was just living like 100 miles away. I grew up like about 100 miles away from there. you see them on the news all the time, always negative stuff, like these cult members taking over the town of Antelope, Oregon, and importing homeless people to vote, and then just kind of abandoning them after they did their duty by voting in these Osho followers as the new town council and all that. And then, of course, Sheila, who was like the right-hand person of Osho in America, like literally trying to influence the vote by poisoning people in like salad bars at restaurants in town, that kind of thing, like inoculating salmonella into the salad bars at restaurants, this kind of thing to reduce the people voting on this election. So the homeless people that they imported, plus the ashram members, can take over the town council. And then they changed the name of Antelope, Oregon to Rajneeshpuram, Oregon, and all this. It was a big scandal. But at that time, Osho, he wasn't even talking anymore. He was apparently taking some kind of drugs and just kind of staying in his cabin. And this nutty Sheila woman was just kind of running amok. So, yeah, I would agree that he was a good orator and just amazingly could talk for 2 hours straight every day and not just keep repeating himself. I assume he didn't. And he did have some wisdom, but I do not think that he was enlightened, even though some people are just sure that he was enlightened. Like I remember one time when I was in Bali, there's a bunch of, around the city of Ubud in central Bali, there's like an expat community of like artists, Western artists and so forth. And there's quite a few ex-followers of Osho there. And I met a few of them when I was in Bali. And I was asking, what do you think about Osho? Do you think he was enlightened? And this one German artist who lived there, he just rolled his eyes and it was obvious. He was unlike anybody I ever met in my life. He was clearly enlightened. And then there was another person who was on the board of directors for Osho. He was kind of non-committal. He really couldn't answer either way, that kind of thing. But personally, I'm skeptical that Osho really was enlightened. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from RFS. And we've been going for an hour and 22 minutes. Okay. RFS says, do you have enough money to live well? Yeah, we're getting along. I'm not rich, but the house is paid for. The cars are paid for. I do make enough money to pay my bills. And so, yeah, we're doing all right. I'm not complaining. Let's see. All it would take is like one disaster to wipe us out. It's like some health disaster or something. Yeah, that could, even with health insurance, that still, it can mess you up. But I've been living my life kind of the way ancient people have lived their lives. People have lived their lives this way for forever. It's just, you just have faith that you won't be one of the 10% of the population that just gets wiped out by some disaster. So there is that. But yeah, answering the question, which is a yes or no question. Yeah, I do have enough money to live well enough. I was an ascetic living in a cave with no money for 30 years, or in the cave for 20 something years. No, in the cave for however many years. But I don't have very high standards with regard to quality of life. This house is just, totally beyond what I would have even gone for. It's just, this is largely the result of my woman, who has been living sort of a worldly life, more so than me, for a few decades anyhow. So there is that. I kind of married into money or something to some extent, even though she doesn't work for a living. So, yeah, I guess so. So next question from RFS is, if you didn't have enough money, would you ask your audience for help? And I don't know. If there was some kind of calamity. The house burned down, and somehow we had spaced off paying the last insurance bill. I mean, I personally just do not believe in insurance. The only reason I have any insurance at all is because the law requires it when my woman insists upon it. But insurance is essentially betting against yourself. You're actually wagering money that something bad will happen to you. And in my opinion, it probably increases the likelihood that something bad will happen to you. So if I didn't have enough money, would I ask my audience for help? Maybe. I mean, we'll just have to wait till we get to that point, if it ever happens, and then we'll see. I mean, more likely, I would just kind of describe the situation and let people decide what they wanted to do about it. I don't want to put anyone on the spot. Give me $1, anything like that. So, yeah, at present, life is relatively good. So I've got no complaints. Some people have been sending money, like generous contributions. One recently for $77.77. Like a couple weeks before that, somebody sent $100. So I mean, it's appreciated. It's nice to know that people value what I am contributing enough that they even think to send $5. So I mean, that's kind of gratifying, I suppose. And the money is well spent. We buy groceries and stuff. So, I just move on to the next question, I guess. This is from Newman. And Newman says, when you were a monk and you were living with other monks in a monastery, how did you overcome the tension and other issues like subtle passive aggression and other low-intensity social conflicts that arose? Well, when I was a monk and living with other monks in a monastery, I mostly just avoided everybody. Just stayed by myself. Just stayed in a little cabin or in a cave on the outskirts of the monastery, that kind of thing. But still, if there's problems, tension, and other issues, subtle passive aggression, yeah, that's that. I mean, you're more likely in a monastery to have like an explosion than a subtle passive aggression, at least in my experience, because a monastery or an ashram, someplace like that, is a pressure cooker. It's like an emotional pressure cooker because you're supposed to be restrained. Monks are supposed to be restrained. And so when you restrain your urges, they don't just go away. They just build up pressure in the subconscious mind until they start percolating up to the surface in the forms of like hysteria. That's why you had so many like, what was it? The Devils of Loudun. Like it was a book by Aldous Huxley, like a historical book about just these, I think they were medieval or very early modern Catholic nuns in France that were just going off the deep end, or just like the witch trials, like witch mania among Puritans. It's the Puritans were so self-restrained, or like the like in Spain, like in the 16th century, again, they were so restrained through their religious beliefs and so forth that they just became hysterical. And you're much more likely to have like public witch burnings and so forth. People just freaking out. People supposedly being possessed by the devil and all this in these really repressed environments, these repressed societies. And a monastery is like that. So I remember one time there was an attendant at a monastery in California that I was staying at who referred to the place as a shit accelerator, just because of all this stuff comes up to the surface more easily, and partly because you're trying to examine yourself. It's like everything's under like a magnifying glass, so that kind of exacerbates the problem too. So there was a few times when there was just like blow-ups at a monastery. Quite a few times. Wasn't so much of a problem with subtle passive aggression. It was more like boom, shit hitting fan, that kind of thing. So how did I overcome the tension and other issues? Well, partly, it's just you're reading the text that the suttas say, you shouldn't indulge in angry speech and so forth. So, I mean, you're just mindful of it. You watch it arise and pass away. If you're like conscientious and it occurs to you to do this, other monks might, they might indulge in backbiting and so forth more than I did. But I remember the first monastery where I was ordained, there was a German nun there who, in my opinion, had a classic textbook case of schizophrenia and was extremely difficult to get along with. For example, she saw no reason whatsoever why she should cooperate with anybody, especially after she started hearing the voice telling her that she was enlightened and so forth. It was a very difficult situation. And at the same time that was going on, you had Burmese supporters of the monastery trying to take over the monastery from the board of directors who owned the deed to the land and so forth. So there's all this uproar going on, which is one of the reasons why I went to Burma. Some of the senior monks at that monastery told me, you should just go to Burma for a few years until things settle down here. So I went to Burma and I stayed there for more than 20 years because things didn't settle down. They just got worse. But how did I overcome the tension and other issues? Mainly just through self-awareness, observing these urges arise, noting them, and not acting upon them. That would be just the standard Buddhist approach, or at least the Theravada Buddhist approach to, interpersonal friction and so forth. Although there was a couple times early on in Burma where I just kind of popped. There was one time, there was this monk. It was like my karma that I would always be living next door to the worst monk at the monastery, assuming that I wasn't the worst. Some people might have seen it that way, but it's like the least conscientious monk at the monastery would be my next door neighbor. And I was staying at this one monastery, and maybe I shouldn't mention his name, but he was a farmer. He was a village farmer who became a monk just to kind of take it easy, live an easy life. But he remained a farmer. He was raising chickens. He was farming. He's planting crops and so forth, just as a hobby. It was just what he'd done his entire life. And one time I was walking back from alms round, and I see some guy with a blue towel turban. In Burma, it's typical for older Burmese guys to take just a big bath towel and just make a turban and just wear that. He had just wearing a sarong and a turban, and he's just hacking away at the ground, digging up some new flower bed or something, more likely a gourd bed. And I was thinking, man, looks like there's some layperson there digging in so-and-so's front yard in front of his meditation cabin. And then I realized that it was so-and-so himself. And he'd be sneaking down to my area to cut bamboo, where my cave was. It was one of the only clumps of bamboo on the monastery. He'd be sneaking down there when I was gone. And one day I just decided I didn't want to go for alms round that day. So I happened to be there, and I see so-and-so coming down the rock stairs into my little valley, my little canyon, with a machete. And I'm thinking, what is he doing? And then I start hearing chopping sounds, and it's the bamboo. So I just run out there and just start yelling at him and just snatch the machete away from him. Just drive him off, yelling at him. So then, of course, I get called to talk to Seattle, the abbot. And I explain what's happening, and he said, well, you really have to give his machete back. You don't want to be stealing his stuff, that kind of thing. I was having a few doubts about whether I really was excommunicated for stealing, for just taking his machete away. Although, according to the texts, if a monk he owns something inappropriate, it's like a monk owns a gun or drugs or something, other monks can take that from him, and it's not stealing because he's not supposed to have it to begin with. So that was my loophole, I guess. But that sort of thing did happen sometimes. Let's see. But again, what you're supposed to do is irritation or aversion, ill will arises. You just note it and let it go and do not act upon it. And I'm going to move on to Newman's next question, which is as follows. Did monks mutually believe that their I-ness that felt and caused conflicts to be illusory, and therefore issues like that were resolved more easily than in secular life where people cling to egos? So this is sort of like an elaboration on the previous question, I guess, or just a follow-up to it. Maybe it was all intended to be one question. Yeah, I think that the serious monks, yeah, I mean, they would take Dhamma seriously, and they would do like what I said, it's just like ill will or aversion arises, then, I mean, you just say that's not appropriate. I shouldn't indulge in this sort of thing. And if you're mindful, you just note it and let it go. And even if you're not extremely mindful, you're mindful enough to know that you're feeling irritation at this other person, then still, because, I mean, Asian cultures are very kind of self-disciplined anyway. Like, for someone to lose their shit in Asian culture is way worse than for someone to lose their shit in America. It's just like a scandal. Somebody like loses their cool in public in Burma or like Japan. Now, at least it used to be that way in Japan. I haven't been there in a long time. But in Burma, it's like you got two people having a shouting match in public. And it's just like everyone's just, their mouth just drops open, their eyebrows go, because, I mean, that sort of thing is just not supposed to happen. Everyone's supposed to be calm and polite in public. So, I mean, in Asia, that kind of thing is more rare than here anyway, I think. But, yeah, I mean, if you had serious monks, they're going to just be mindful of the irritation or ill will or whatever that's starting to arise. Or even if they can't manage that, at least they know I shouldn't be like yelling at somebody because I'm a monk in a monastery. I'm a Buddhist. So, they can at least put on the brakes enough that they can sort of get along. There's still monks that kind of didn't like each other. They might avoid each other, that kind of thing. But still, I mean, there's real conflicts. Like, I mean, some monasteries in Burma, especially like around Mandalay or some places in Shan State also, they're just notorious for being snake pits. Like, I stayed at Mahagandeo, and I've told this story before, I'm pretty sure. And around the Mahagandeo is in Amarapura, which is near, just right on it's like a suburb of Mandalay. And just some of the monks there are just rotten monks. Why they become monks in the first place, I'm not sure. They just didn't want to work for a living, or they just wanted a free education at a monastic university or something. They wanted a higher social status from being a monk, something like that. But they really weren't serious about really striving for liberation, any such thing. So there was one monk, person in robes with a shaved head, that was living in a nearby school monastery. And school monasteries were among the worst, because they were just into the theory without so much practice. And anyway, this monk supposedly was sneaking into our monastery during the Uposatha ceremony, when the Patimokkha rules are being recited. All the monks have to congregate in the Dhamma hall. So all the monks are in the Dhamma hall for this ceremony. This guy would sneak in and steal Bhattatikas, which is a kind of commentary or sub-commentary. And in school monasteries, these Bhattatikas are hard to get, and they're relatively expensive. So he was stealing them from monks' cabins and then selling them at this other monastery. So, I mean, technically he wasn't really a monk because he was a thief. So then one of the Anunayaka Sayadaw, it's sort of like the sub-Sayadaw of that part of the monastery. It was a big monastery. He decided he was just going to lie in ambush for this guy. So he didn't attend the Patimokkha recitation. He he lay in wait for this guy. And he caught him. He was kind of a macho. This Anunayaka Sayadaw was kind of a macho monk. He was a tough guy. And so he catches him, and then he gets turned over to the police or whatever. He was defrocked because he wasn't a monk anyway, because he was stealing stuff, possibly even went to jail. And like a few months later, a friend of this thief sneaks into the monastery, comes up behind that anattā and just chops him in the head with a machete, and kind of grazes the side of his head, causes his ear to kind of like peel off like this. So he was in the hospital for quite a while after that. And this is like monks. I remember the first time or second time I went to the Mandalay City morgue to watch autopsies, because monks are supposed to observe death, So I go to the city morgue, and the coroner there said that just a few days previously they had found a dead monk, and in his opinion, that monk had been murdered by other monks. Just based on the autopsy they did and whatever evidence they found. He didn't go into details. But that kind of stuff can happen. So if you've got serious monks who are like conscientious, devout Buddhists, then, there can be some friction and so forth, but still they take Dhamma seriously and they don't just act out. But at the other end of the spectrum, you've got snake pit monasteries in Asia. I mean, they're relatively rare in America, I'm sure. But in Asia, there's just snake pit monasteries where it's sort of like Catholic monasteries in medieval Europe, where some of them were just really, really awful. Like the Pope or some bishop will send some reform, some disciplinarian to a monastery to get things back in order, and he just gets killed off immediately. He just gets murdered by the monks there. That sort of thing happened. And in Burma, occasionally it may still happen. So, I mean, there are serious, very devout, conscientious monks in Burma, and then they're like the opposite in Burma. There's all kinds. So, let's see. I mean, in the West, there's a little bit of that in the West. Like, for example, back in like the early 90s, when I was a monk in California, before I went to Burma, I was told that at Stockton, California, there was a Cambodian monastery who had the Cambodian Sangha Raja was living in exile there. And just so you know, Yoda in the Star Wars movies was based largely on this Cambodian Sangha Raja. And he was over 100 years old. But the thing was, there's a lot of like Cambodian gangs in Stockton, or at least there were in the early 90s. And when things were starting to get too hot, like some gang members got the cops looking for him, he'll go and hide out in the monastery. So you have these gang members with like guns and hot rods and so forth that just become monks temporarily, while they're hiding from the police. And, they're not really monks. They're barely even Buddhists. Hardly any more Buddhist than the mafia is Catholic. So that kind of thing can happen in the West also. But I'm kind of completely strayed away from the question. And so let's just stray all the way from the question and move on to the next question, shall we? And this is from Siddhartha Lohachita. And Siddhartha Lohachita, he's got a sticky one here. He says, my future wife is of Serbian origin and a practicing Orthodox Christian. Christian religion is very important to her. She has no intention or desire to hear about the Dhamma. For her, everything from India is the same, and she doesn't pay much attention. She says that if we have a child, the child must be baptized before the month, as the church commands. As she says, I really don't want any trouble or discussion. If you would be me, how would you approach this matter? Leave the child alone, and when he or she is older, explain to him or her about Buddha or the Dhamma. Yeah, so that is kind of a sticky situation. You got a Buddhist man marrying a Christian woman who insists that any children that they have be raised Christian. I would guess that your children are going to observe the husband doing his Buddhist devotions and have some curiosity, probably ask, why are you doing that, Daddy? And then the father, he has the obligation to at least answer. maybe he should, in order to avoid any kind of blow up in the house, not try to convert his children to Buddhism, but still, I mean, he should give honest, objective answers that a child can understand when the child is asking about the Buddhist altar, for example, or why daddy is sitting cross-legged on a cushion for an hour every day, that sort of thing. Yeah, I think maybe, I mean, if you really do have your heart set on marrying this woman who really has no use at all for Buddhism, then it may be the wise thing to do is just let your children get old enough that they're able to think for themselves to some degree, and then you can be more forthcoming in your explanations of Dhamma and so forth. So, but I don't think you're going to be able to just completely keep it a secret that you're a Buddhist and not an Orthodox Christian. To keep it a secret from your children. So, I mean, sooner or later, there's going to have to be some kind of resolution of the situation. I mean, your kids are probably going to have to know that you're not a Christian. You know, they're going to church. Maybe your wife insists that you go to church too, but still your kids are eventually going to figure out that you're not a Christian, that you're a Buddhist instead, and they're going to be curious. You know, why are you a Buddhist, Daddy? That kind of thing. Why aren't you a Christian? And I mean, what are you going to do? Just say, well, your mother won't allow me to say anything about the issue. I mean, to some degree, I mean, you have to be a man and put your foot down a little bit. I mean, it isn't just a one-way street. You don't just obey. So, yeah, I mean, you would be under the obligation to at least give a brief, concise answer to what your children are asking you. I mean, you don't have to try to proselytize and convert them to Buddhism, but still, you should be honest. And children are more into imitating their parents than just believing what their parents tell them. So if you have perceptive children who think that, you know, what you're doing seems to be a good thing just based on the vibe you give off when you're doing it, that sort of thing, then there's a good chance that they will be sincerely curious in a positive way about Dhamma as they get older. But you know what you're getting yourself into by marrying a woman who is sort of anti-Buddhist. So that's just sort of what you're going to have to work on. You know, that's going to be one of your projects in life, I think, is kind of navigating through that situation. Unfortunately, I do not have experience in that particular situation. My woman is interested in Dhamma, although, like probably most Buddhists, including Asian Buddhists, it's like it's kind of held as like an abstract ideal, but sometimes it doesn't translate into really believing it when the chips are down. You know, it's like karma, for example, or like, you know, mind over matter, that kind of thing. Most Westerners, including most Western Buddhists, are more materialistic than I am. You know, they have more faith in like scientific realism or that kind of approach to dealing with life than I do, which does cause a certain amount of kind of, I guess you'd call it friction. It's a word that I've been using, but nothing compared with just marrying a woman who really is just kind of anti-Buddhist, who maybe thinks you're going to burn in hell because you're like a heathen or something. I hope she doesn't take it that far. I mean, you could bring up Saint Josaphat. I have been told that Saint Josaphat is canonized in the Orthodox Church as well as the Catholic one. And Saint Josaphat, Josaphat in this case is a corruption of Bodhisattva or Bodhisattva. And this Saint Josaphat is a kind of mythological saint who is based on the Buddha in a previous birth in one of the Jataka stories. I mean, originally it was, I think in the Arabic translation of the Jataka stories, it was Bodhisattva. And then it got as far as, I think, Georgia. Is moving westward along the caravan routes in the Middle Ages. Gets as far as Georgia. I think it became Lodisaf. And then when it got into Greece, it was Yoasaf. And then when it got into like the Latin-speaking areas of Europe at the time, at least Latin was like the learned language at the time, it became Josaphat, Josaphatus, which in English is Josaphat. And I was told by a German monk, he was an Austrian Catholic priest. I don't know why I call him a German monk. He said there is a monastery in Germany where they have a shrine to all of the saints. And Saint Josaphat just has a Buddha image sitting there. Although technically he wasn't the Buddha yet. It was a previous life. I mean, just because, for example, if I was Henry Ford in a previous life, doesn't mean that I'm Henry Ford now. Or that Henry Ford was me. We're just previous life. So I guess I answered that question. But Saint Josaphat, I mean, that could be like a foot in the door anyway, for kind of declaring Buddhism to be at least harmonious with Orthodox Christianity. That, I mean, you're not necessarily going to burn in hell for being a Buddhist. Something like that. Use Saint Josaphat as a foot in the door. Anyways, I'm moving on to the next question. This is from Siovaksh and Sipat Zidana. And Siovaksh and Sipat Zidana says, what's with India's obsession with poop? And Siovaksh and Sipat Zidana just does not like India. He was warned in the past about just continually posting derogatory memes about India and Indians. Well, I mean, India's obsession with poop, I do not consider India to really be obsessed with poop. I mean, there's cow poop. So, I mean, even in Pali texts, ancient India was the same. They would use cow poop as like plastering. They'd plaster walls with cow poop, or they would plaster floors with a mixture of cow poop and like clay, that kind of thing. And it was just, the cow was man's best friend in the ancient Ganges Valley. The dog wasn't man's best friend in the ancient Ganges Valley. It was the cow. And there are suttas, or just texts in the Pali Tipitaka, like some of it's in Vinaya, where the Buddha is just talking about how the cow is the great benefactor to mankind. It's like they have this idea that anything that comes out of cows can't be all bad. And so that may have had something to do, this pastoralist society of the Indo-Aryans invading the Ganges Valley, starting in the northwest of India and then moving down the Ganges, that, before the Buddha's time, there was no money economy in India. I mean, it was just starting up around the time of the Buddha. Maybe slightly before the time of the Buddha, a money economy was entering India. And so before that, wealth was cows. How many cows do you have? That's how rich you are. And so it was sort of like a bovine-centric culture to some degree. Even now, you got the sacred cows in India that just wander around wherever they want to. And so cows have always been a big deal in India. And cow poop, it has certain uses. You can dry it out and burn it as fuel. You can plaster your walls and your floor with it. It has certain medicinal properties, apparently, or at least people believed it did. So, I mean, is that kind of, I wouldn't call it an obsession with poop, but at least it was an acceptance of cow dung as something that isn't just necessarily just icky and disgusting. And then, of course, you can add the fact that in modern India, for some reason, entire villages just don't see the point in digging outhouse latrines, and they just poop in a field. They just crap by the side of the road, that kind of thing. So that's different. It's not really an obsession. That's just not seeing the point of digging a latrine pit. So I'm not exactly sure why India, and some Burmese villages, I've been to a few Burmese villages where they just have like a designated shitting field. I made the mistake of wandering through one once. It was a shortcut. I just see this field. I didn't know it was the shitting field. And I start heading out through the field, and people start yelling, "No, don't do it." But it was too late. And you start seeing, you're actually in a kind of fecal minefield. And why India is so lackadaisical, so unmotivated to dig latrines and just are willing to have villagers just crap on the ground in random places, I don't know, but I don't consider that really to be an obsession. And it seems to be a different order from the acceptance of cow poop as sort of an occasionally beneficial substance. But aside from that, I really don't know enough about Indian culture to know if there's any more poop stuff that I could discuss here. And I'm just going to move on to Siovaksha and Sipat Zidano's next question, which is, realistically, how do we spread Buddhism across the globe? Ashoka was able to do it in all of India before being replaced, but it has survived in higher IQ places like East Asia. I'm assuming it can be done today as well, but needs strategic planning. Well, yeah, I mean, it would take some kind of strategic planning, I guess, to come up with a form of Buddhism that would be acceptable. I mean, you don't want like the leftist academic queer Buddhism taken over, obviously. Because that's just semi-Buddhism at best. That's like political correctness with Buddhist flavoring added. There's like radical leftist political correctness with some Buddhist flavoring added. I mean, you consider like medieval Japan that was largely Buddhist, not entirely Buddhist. And there was a lot of Shinto and even some Christianity once the Portuguese and Spaniards started showing up there. Feudal Japan. I mean, they were militaristic Buddhists. Not only the samurai, but you had the military monks that were sort of like the Japanese version of monks Templar. So there's no telling. I mean, Buddhism, if you could just turn it into like a kind of the sort of thing that I prefer, which is like a philosophical Buddhism where you're using the philosophy in a practical manner, just realize whenever you're unhappy, it's because you desire something. Just simple stuff like that just gets added into the culture. Maybe even mindfulness as a kind of panacea, that sort of thing. Yeah, I mean, that's possible, I guess, but in all likelihood, it would continue along the lines of how it's already been going, where America is so eclectic. They just take a few Buddhist ideas that seem to work, like mindfulness to improve productivity and general health among the workers of a corporation, or using mindfulness as stress relief in hospitals and that sort of thing. But I mean, just awareness of the second noble truth would just be a godsend, so to speak, in American culture or Western culture, who are mainly just scientific materialists. So how do we spread Buddhism across the globe? Yeah, just deal with like really useful, helpful stuff. Second noble truth, for example. I mean, just that much Buddhism really taking root in the West would be just a huge improvement, in my opinion. Whenever you're unhappy, it's because you desire something, and it's really ultimately your choice to desire it or not. So, I mean, it would pretty much collapse the left if that sort of Buddhism, if that sort of Buddhism really took root, because the left seems to, at least nowadays, like the progressive radical left, it's like their bread and butter is blaming patriarchal white men for their problems, or you just blame somebody else. Blame Donald Trump. You're unhappy because Donald Trump, or you're unhappy because, somebody else. I mean, they just do not take responsibility for themselves. It's somebody else's fault if they're unhappy. And so just an awareness of the second noble truth would pretty much cure that. Although you can't really fix stupid. So, I mean, even a lot of Buddhists in like Burma, still they're materialists. They'll accept Buddhist philosophy at like this abstract level, but it's much more difficult for them to actually bring it into practice and actually use Buddhist philosophy to improve their lives. So let's see here. Did I answer the question though? I'm assuming it can be done today as well. It needs strategic planning. Yeah. Well, we're just gonna have to see how it works. Just see how the Western monastic system. See if that continues to expand in influence in the West, especially in America. I really don't have much hope for Europe at present. They're really going to have to grow a pair in Europe if they're going to improve the situation, because it's just, I mean, the Europeans have been castrated as a general rule. The Western Europeans and some Central Europeans, Eastern Europeans, they've survived Marxism and they're still relatively tough. They still have some, and they sort of, the pendulum swung back into like Orthodox Christianity to a large degree in Eastern Europe. And so they're actually in a healthier position. Also, some of the Eastern European countries are just refusing to take these migrants, these illegal aliens flooding the continent. So, yeah, I mean, for Buddhism to take over the West, I think strategic planning is fine, but really what it's going to take is some inspired, charismatic Buddhist leader who is able to really persuade people, an influencer of some sort. And I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is also from Siovax and Sipad Zidana. And he says, a certain monk said that monotheistic religions inherently lead to violence because they think all non-believers are going to hell anyways, and thus don't see an issue with erasing those people and their cultures either. I doubt Zoroastrians think like that, but do you think this sentiment is unique to the Abrahamic religions? Gosh, I don't think so. I mean, just because you're monotheistic doesn't mean that you're going to be violent. I mean, the Quakers and the Jehovah's Witnesses are monotheistic and they're not particularly violent. Although the Jehovah's Witnesses don't believe in hell either. They just think that non-believers and bad people will just get poofed out of existence by God, that there is no hell, even though hell is mentioned in the Bible. And then, I mean, you can have like systems that aren't monotheistic that are like violently intolerant. I would assume there have been some violently intolerant pagan sects over the course of the existence of the human race. Even going back to like feudal Japan, that you probably had some violently intolerant Buddhists, even sort of quasi-Buddhists, samurai Zen Buddhists anyway. Let's see. I guess the militant monks in Japan were Pure Land Buddhists mostly, though. So, yeah, I think just the Abrahamism is really more of an issue than the monotheism. The Abrahamism, I mean, the Old Testament is like the original Abrahamic scripture, I guess. The oldest one we still have access to anyway. And it's pretty damn violent. Although the violence was more of a like cultural and ethnic thing than a religious thing, it seems to me. That the religion was just used as a way of strengthening like ethnic claims, over land and so forth. So let's see here. Do I think this sentiment is unique to Abrahamic religions? I'm sure there have been other. It seems to be mainly Abrahamic religions that justify persecuting non-believers nowadays. But that's largely because Abrahamic religions pretty much dominate Western civilization. And I mean, I am sure there have been like intolerant Shintoists in Japan, or just intolerant certain sects of paganism, our gods are better than your gods, and so we're going to wipe out your village, that kind of thing. I'm sure it has happened. But it's just that nowadays the trend is that violent intolerance is more of an Abrahamic thing. Not so much of a Christian thing anymore either. It seems mostly Muslims and Jews are the ones whose scriptures endorse violence against humans under certain circumstances, and they just take that to heart and just go for it. I mean, Christianity was relatively nonviolent from the beginning. It became violent, like in the Middle Ages especially, which helps keep Western civilization Christian, I suppose. Charles Martel and all that. Good Christians fighting off the Saracens, Crusades, that kind of thing. But yeah, I think it's more of an Abrahamic thing than a monotheistic thing. And I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Cherzaskaziz. And Cherzaskaziz says, is there anywhere in the monastic rules of discipline mention of monks being allowed to teach Dhamma only to those who want to listen? Yeah, in the Sekya rules of the Patimokkha, there's many rules preventing a monk from teaching Dhamma to someone who is not showing respect. So I assume that it's not just people who want to listen, but people who want to listen respectfully. Like there's a rule, a monk isn't supposed to teach Dhamma to someone who's wearing shoes, which is kind of weird in the West, but I guess in a lot of Dhamma halls, you take your shoes off anyway. But that's just that in ancient India, it was a sign of respect that you take your shoes off before approaching some wise elder or teacher. Or you're not allowed to teach Dhamma to someone who is walking on the path if you're walking beside the path, a walking path. Someone's walking on the trail or walking on a sidewalk and you're like walking by the side of the road off the sidewalk, then you shouldn't be teaching Dhamma to that person because they're not showing respect for you. You're not supposed to teach Dhamma to someone who's holding a weapon just because that's kind of disrespectful. They should set the weapon down, set their knife down or whatever it is before you teach them Dhamma. Or you're not allowed to teach Dhamma to someone who is sitting if you're standing, which that's another one that gets broken a lot just because Western culture is different. But it's considered to be more respectful for the teacher to be sitting and the layperson to be standing. In fact, there's a weird monastic rule of discipline saying that nuns have to remain standing in the presence of a monk, which of course they don't follow. Let's see. So there's lots of rules like that where a monk is not allowed to teach Dhamma to someone who is not showing respect for Dhamma and for the Sangha. So people who don't want to listen would be people who really aren't respectful. So you shouldn't be teaching them. I mean, maybe if they're a devout Buddhist and they're just having some kind of crisis or meltdown and you're trying to talk sense to them and they don't want to hear it at first, that could be like an excuse. But someone who just despises Buddhism, they think Buddhism is just bullshit or whatever, then a monk technically is forbidden to teach Dhamma to these people. And I'm just going to move on to the next question from Cherzaskaziz. He says, Buddhist lay people ought to follow 5 precepts. What other ancient religions did follow them also? Of modern religion, I can think of some Christian sects that are not using wine, like Seventh-day Adventists. I don't understand Christians who think that drinking alcohol is wrong, considering that Jesus drank alcohol in the text. In fact, one of his first miracles was turning water into wine. But let's get back to the question here. Following 5 precepts, that was just an Indian thing. That for lay people to follow 5 precepts was common to several spiritual systems in ancient North India in the Buddhist time. So the Buddhists had 5 precepts. The Jains had 5 precepts. The Vedic Brahmanists had 5 precepts. It's just that the 5th precept would vary. So with the Jains, the 5th precept wasn't a prohibition on drinking alcohol. It was a prohibition on private property. So it was kind of a communistic thing. I don't remember what the 5th precept was for the the Vedic Brahmanists, the Vedists in the Buddhist time. They weren't technically Hindu yet. But to have 5 precepts was just sort of a cultural thing in North India. And the first 4 were common to various groups. It was the 5th precept, which in Buddhism is against drinking alcohol, that varied among the different schools. So the 5th precept might have been sort of like the latest one, kind of like an afterthought or something, or just a way of the different schools to differentiate themselves by having a slightly different list of 5 precepts. With regard to non-Indian spiritual systems, well, I mean, it wouldn't necessarily be 5 precepts. Like Judeo-Christian tradition has 10 commandments. And then, of course, the Jews have Mosaic law, which is, it's like Vinaya for Jewish people, which is lots and lots of rules. Thou shalt not muzzle the ox that treadeth out the grain and all that. Which reminds me of that similar rule in the Bible, thou shalt not boil a kid in its mother's milk, which somehow got interpreted to mean that Jews can't eat meat and dairy products at the same meal, which is kind of strange. It's really kind of a stretch, in my opinion. Let's see here. So I suppose I answered that question. I mean, different religions will have different lists of commandments or precepts or whatever. Like the Pythagoreans of ancient Greece and ancient Rome, they had their moral codes. There's moral codes in just about any religion. Just honor your mother and father. Don't steal. Don't commit murder. Don't lie. Don't commit adultery. I mean, that's basic morals. So, yeah, I'd say most religions worthy of the name would have some kind of moral code. Not necessarily a list of 5, though. And I'm just going to move on to the next question. Let's see. We are getting kind of close to the bottom here. So I don't think we're going to go for 3 hours. This is from Practice Metta. And Practice Metta says, did you undergo any preparation for your ayahuasca trips? In my research, fasting is common since, at the very least, it can prevent purging. Yeah, getting well, they call it sometimes. And sometimes they just call it puking. Driving the big white steering wheel. Although I guess in an ayahuasca ceremony, you don't have the big white steering wheel. You've got like this little plastic bucket. So did I undergo any preparation for an ayahuasca journey? You should call it a trip. Makes it sound like it's a drug or something instead of a medicine. No, I didn't undergo any preparation at all, really. I didn't fast. Maybe I should have, but I do remember being told the very first ayahuasca journey I went to, a ceremony, that ayahuasca really is not an emetic. It doesn't have any physiological, emetic properties that makes you puke. It's just that it's like you undergo such emotional stress that it's like your body's thinking, well, just in case it's something I ate, I better get rid of that. So it's almost like an instinct. It's like a reflex of responding to stress more than any actual puke-inducing properties in the ayahuasca. And not everybody throws up when they take ayahuasca. I remember asking this one lady, how was your journey after the ceremony? And she's like, oh, it was lovely. It was nice, and it's like, did you take the same stuff as me? I was like, it just turned me inside out. And then I knew this one guy who it had no effect on him whatsoever. There's like the shaman is like giving him concentrated doses. In fact, at one point he was making him eat this ball of the stuff, and it had no effect on him whatsoever. None whatsoever. He just had like white bread karma. He was like this really clean-cut American guy who you'd never expect would have any interest in Eastern mysticism or anything like that. But it turns out that he'd gone on a pilgrimage to Ramana Maharshi's monastery, or his ashram at Arunachala in southern India, and he was trying ayahuasca ceremonies and everything, but he was so Richie Cunningham. He was just so straight-laced. He just had this white bread karma, apparently, that just would not allow him to experience this transcendental stuff that other people would experience. But I'm just like digressing all over the place, aren't I? He's really a nice guy, though. See, no, I did not undergo any preparations, including fasting, anything like that. I just assumed at first it would be sort of like, taking LSD or something. There's no real purification rituals that are necessary for that. You just take it and it has its effect. And I wound up puking a lot, loudly. So I'm just going to move on to Practice Meta's next question. As a biologist, have you looked into the mRNA COVID shot at all, and whether its risks were understated in 2020? Man, you can get banned from YouTube from answering this question just like a year or two ago, right? I think nowadays you can sort of be like honest with regard to this stuff. God, I hope so. As a biologist, have I looked into the mRNA COVID shot at all? No, not really. I mean, you just pick stuff up through osmosis. You just see stuff online, that kind of thing. But I'm a pure blood. I never got the shot. I've had the coof at least twice, and so I've got like natural resistance to it now, I guess. Although it does mutate like a virus, like the cold virus. It mutates so that when it mutates into a different kind of strain with different properties, then you can catch it again. But yeah, I mean, it does seem. I mean, I hope it's okay to say this stuff now, but it does seem that for older people, it may have been beneficial. People who are immunocompromised, that kind of thing. It may have done more good than harm. But like inoculating 18-year-olds, really the effect is about the same as a bad cold. Then it seems to have done more harm than good. I think more people may have been harmed by more young people may have been harmed by some of the vaccines than by the virus itself. But I think I should just move on to the next question. This is from Sampapalapa, and this is the last question. Sampapalapa says, I was listening to a sutta called Impossible, possibly, most likely, a later edition and not exactly the Buddha's true words, maybe, perhaps, I don't know. But in the sutta, Buddha says that two Buddhas can't arise in the same solar system. What word and cosmic understanding was explained that could be the synonym to solar system 2,600 years ago? Why do you think the translators put solar system instead of whatever the contemporary Buddha saw as the cosmos? I've kind of got an idea of the cosmic model Theravada has, so I'm guessing some kind of flat island-like area in sensual realms that contracts and expands through the kalpas of change, but I just wonder why they translated it that and didn't leave the Pali word. Also, I'm guessing it has to do with change in the collective conceptions of the world when it comes to a particular worldview a society has. Okay, well, I don't know exactly what sutta he's referring to, but in all likelihood, the word translated as solar system is chakavala. Chaka means wheel. Vala, I'm not exactly sure what vala means. But a chakavala is like a flat earth. It's sort of like this disc, and you've got 4 great continents in the center. And human beings live on the southern continent, which corresponds to India. And you've got Mount Meru in the center, and you've got concentric rings of mountain ranges surrounding Mount Meru, which probably is based among the ancient Indians of the North Ganges, of the Ganges Valley, as the Himalaya Mountains. The Himalaya Mountains were probably seen as like the foothills of Mount Meru, which was farther north. And the sun and moon are relatively small, a few hundred miles across, and they orbit around Mount Meru. So their early Buddhism was believed in a flat earth, and a sun and moon that orbited around Mount Meru in the center. And there was, aside from the 4 continents, you had assorted islands, like Sri Lanka, for example. And then at the outer edge, you had this big wall of like stone or natural metal of some sort that holds the water in, because in ancient India, they had really no concept of gravity. What caused gravity? They just assumed the entire universe had the same up-down orientation. So probably all the Chakavalas, and there were countless numbers of Chakavalas in the universe, they all had the same up-down orientation in space, sort of like the old Star Trek, where 2 spaceships, meet in space. They always have the same up-down orientation. You never see one of them in the view screen that's like sideways, because just, I don't know. So Chakavala, yeah, it would be like a world system. And the sutta that says that 2 Buddhas can't arise in the same world system, the same Chakavala, they mean at the same time. It's like you can't have 2 Buddhas at the same time on the same earth. That's just one of those things. It's just one of those things that Abhidhamma never really explains, I'm pretty sure, why it is that all Buddhas have to like sit under, they have to renounce the world in some kind of vehicle. They've got to do austerities for X amount of time. They've got to have this entourage of fellow ascetics with them as they do their austerities. They have to be handed the milk rice by the friendly laywoman, and they have to sit under some Bodhi tree in order to become enlightened. Why is it like that? It's just this archetype. And why can there not be 2 Buddhas at the same time just through random chance, like an accident? The cosmic order just will not allow it for reasons that are never fully specified. But this solar system that they translated, it's not a very good translation, but most people probably wouldn't know what Chakavala means if you left it untranslated. Probably better would be like one world system. One world. But let's see. What word in cosmic understanding was explained that could be the synonym to solar system 2600? Oh yeah, it's Chakavala. And there were like an infinite number of them just throughout space. So let's see. Why do you think the translators put solar system instead of whatever the contemporary Buddha saw as their cosmos? Well, that might be they're not very good translators, for starters, maybe. And they just wanted to use some kind of word that would kind of come close to the original meaning. I mean, it kind of is a solar system, but it's not a solar system because the sun isn't even at the center of it in a Chakavala. The earth, Mount Meru on earth, is the center. And then you've got like the Asuras are like chained up, or some of them are chained up under Mount Meru. The top of Mount Meru is Tawatimsa heaven. Right up at the pinnacle, that's where Tawatimsa heaven is, right at the very top of Mount Meru, or Sumeru, as it is called sometimes. So, let's see here. I'm guessing it has to do with change in the collective conceptions of the world when it comes to a particular worldview of society. Yeah, ancient India, they just, like most ancient cultures, just assume the earth is flat. Because it looks flat, and so long as you don't examine it too carefully, like, curvature of large bodies of water, for example, that you can see that. But they just guessed that the earth was flat. And I mean, it was pre-Buddhist. I mean, the Buddha didn't come up with this stuff. He just, like, when it comes to cosmology or other things also, a lot of cultural stuff, the founder of religion isn't inventing it from scratch. Jesus didn't invent like the sort of proto-Jewish milieu in which he was living. He just accepted that as just part of the cultural stuff and used that as a kind of framework for teaching what he was teaching. And that's what the Buddha was doing in India. The Buddha didn't come up with the idea that the earth is flat or that Mount Meru is in the center. I mean, that was just this early mythology that, I mean, like other Indo-European groups had a similar mythology, like the ancient Greeks. The gods live on top of a mountain, and they had a war in ancient times against the Titans. The Titans were defeated and chained up at the base of Mount Olympus. I almost said a different mountain, but it was the Greeks considered Olympus to be where the gods live, and the Titans are chained up at the bottom. I don't think they went so far as to consider Mount Olympus to be the center of the earth, though. I think like the Oracle of Delphi or something was considered to be the center of the earth. And the Romans apparently considered the Mediterranean to be the center of the earth because that's what Mediterranean means. Middle of the world. Middle of the Roman world, anyway. So, yeah, it was just what people believed before the Buddha came along, and it was just the culture that he inherited. And so what he had to teach had to be done to a large degree within the context of just the beliefs of the people. You can't just completely reject the entire worldview of a group of people. Like if Jesus of Nazareth just completely rejected Judaism, I don't think he would have lived long enough to get crucified. He would have been stoned to death by a howling mob long before that. And also, I mean, he wouldn't have been effective as a teacher at all because people would just reject what he said. If the Buddha is just completely rejecting, he's saying the earth is a globe and it orbits around the sun, then people just weren't ready to hear that stuff yet. I mean, they weren't even ready to hear the stuff like you shouldn't be eating meat. So I guess I answered that question. I'm pretty sure I did. See, why did the translators put solar system instead of whatever the contemporary Buddha saw as the cosmos? Yeah, it's just like a loose translation, about as close as they could come without saying world system. And Chakrawala, most people would not know what a Chakrawala is if they're reading the translation. And so I'm done. I've answered all the questions. At least I tried to answer all the questions. And like I should always say at the beginning, and almost never do, if you have any questions you think I can answer, like about Dharma or Dhamma, early Buddhism, Theravada Buddhism, meditation, that sort of thing, that you think I can answer, even getting into like biology, because I do have a degree in biology, modern politics, because I do keep an eye on that sort of thing, that's fair game too, although really this is a primarily Dharma-oriented program. So if you can like sneak a little Dharma into the biology questions or the politics questions, that would help, I guess. And like and subscribe if you have not done so already, and be happy.